Most of the civilizations that we've learned about this year, whether it's the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, they're still people that live in those areas, but the culture is very, very different now than it was hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago when we're studying about people like Plato or Aristotle or Socrates. However, the civilization that we are going to start this chapter is very, very, very different in that it still has a religion that many people practice today that started thousands of years ago. And they left a lot of cultural influences that influence our world today as well. So this religion is Judaism. The people that practice the religion of Judaism are called Jews, or they're sometimes called the Jewish people, and they come from a group of people called the Hebrews. Now today, more than 15 million people are considered Jewish all over the world, and some live in North America, some live in Europe, and some live in the Middle East. And then there's smaller populations around the world as well. So this is a major world religion. But it's got some very unique things that are very different than some of the other religions that we've talked about. So we're going to look at just some basics of the religion, and we'll talk about some of the ways that it started. So its beliefs and history are recorded in the Hebrew Bible. This is a combination of books spanning several hundreds of years that were written, kind of a rolling history book controlled by the priests of the Jewish people. It directly influenced other religions such as Christianity and Islam. In fact, all three of these religions share similar founders and kind of trace themselves back to similar people and have similar stories that are all connected. It is a monotheistic religion. That means there's just one God. That is the first monotheistic religion we've talked about this year. All of our other religions that we've studied or cultures that we've studied have been polytheistic, meaning they believe in lots of gods. But the Jewish people are a little bit unique in ancient cultures because they only believe in one. And we're going to see that cause some conflict with their neighbors. The earliest followers were known as Hebrews, and they were started off as nomads from Mesopotamia. So we're going to take a look at some of the leaders of the Hebrews, and that's how we'll refer to them while they're still in this nomadic stage, the Hebrews. And today we call the language that Jewish people speak Hebrew as well. And we'll also look at some of the other people that they come into contact with. Our first leader is named Abraham. Now, according to the Hebrew Bible, he lived around 1800 BC in the Mesopotamian city-state of Ur. So the Hebrew Bible says that God spoke to Abraham and told him to travel to Canaan, which would belong to him and his descendants forever. So here is Ur in Mesopotamia, and Canaan was this area kind of between Egypt over here and the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia over here. So this is a fertile area. It's right near the Mediterranean Sea. So with this, it's important to remember that the Hebrews didn't make a distinction between their religion and their history. So much of what we know about the Hebrew religion is tied up with what we know about their history. So you'll hear me say, according to the Hebrew Bible, a lot. But this land that the Hebrews believe God promised to Abraham is called the Promised Land because of God's promise to Abraham. After Abraham died, his sons and their descendants became known as the Israelites. And then Abraham's grandson became the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they lived in this area of Canaan for a few hundred years. And things went pretty well. But we're going to see with our next leader, soon they had to leave Canaan and head somewhere else because of a famine. So several hundred years passed for the Hebrews in Canaan, and things were going pretty well until there was a famine. So after living in Canaan for many years, Jacob's family, and remember Jacob is Abraham's grandson, moved to Egypt because of that famine or lack of food. So they came from here in Canaan down to Egypt. And they said, hey, we'll work here for you. So more and more Hebrews started coming into Egypt. Now, the Egyptian Pharaoh started to learn about the Hebrews and learned that they only believed in one God. Well, that was kind of a problem for the Pharaoh because he thought he was the God, and we know the Egyptians were polytheistic. So he forced the Israelites into slavery because he was afraid they would rebel. So for a while, the Hebrews lived in slavery in Egypt. Along came a gentleman named Moses. The story goes that he was born to a Hebrew family, and the Pharaoh was very afraid of all of the Hebrews rebelling, and so he decided he would kill all the babies to kind of show a force of strength. So the Hebrew Bible says that Moses' mother put him in a basket and sent him down the river, and he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter. So he was raised as a prince. Many years later, the Hebrew Bible says that God spoke to Moses and told Moses to convince the Pharaoh to let Israelites go. But the Pharaoh refused. So the first time Moses asked, the Pharaoh said, "Nope, no way, I'm not letting my slaves go." In response, God sent down 10 plagues, and plagues are diseases, illnesses, things that really badly affect people. After the end of those 10 plagues, the Pharaoh finally let the Hebrews go, and this departure is known as the Exodus. Put a star by that and write the word exit over here. Okay, now let's take a quick look at those 10 plagues so you can see just how bad they were. So the Hebrew Bible says these 10 plagues started with the water turning to blood. Then there were frogs, and frogs don't sound too bad until they take over everything. Then lice, flies everywhere, the cattle dying, boils, fire hail, locusts, darkness covering the land, and finally the Hebrew Bible says that their God caused all of the firstborn males in Egyptian families to die. And the Hebrews were spared from this. I want you to write by Moses, Passover. The Hebrews, or the Jewish people even today, celebrate Passover as when God passed over the Hebrew families and only took the Egyptians. Now God made a covenant or promise with the Hebrews that if he followed a set of rules that he gave them on the Exodus, called the 10 Commandments, he would bless them. So as they were leaving, the Hebrew Bible says that God gave them these 10 Commandments. So let's take a quick look at those 10 Commandments. So you take a look at these, they're up here. And it starts with, do not worship any other gods. The first 4 are all about how the Hebrews should worship their God. The last half is all about how they should treat each other and other people. So it's divided up. And the Hebrews believe that God gave these to Moses, and these were kind of the laws that the Hebrews were required to follow. Now, we've talked about other codes of laws in the ancient world, okay? Things like Hammurabi's Code or the laws written in ancient Greece or really anywhere else that you want to think about. I want you to think about how these might be similar to and different from. So pause the video, read through what are some similarities that we recognize, but also what are some things that are different. And you can think about where did these laws come from as opposed to where some of the other laws that we've studied have come from. Now, when you look at a map, a lot of times people get these 2 journeys confused, the journey of Abraham and the journey of Moses. So I want to point out to you Abraham's journey, starting in Mesopotamia and coming to the Promised Land, looks like the letter A. So I always like to draw an A for Abraham there. And Moses' journey back to the Promised Land after the Hebrews leave Egypt looks like an upside down M. So on the front of your packet, you can trace A for Abraham and M for Moses. You have the same map on the front of your packet. And you can even label A for Abraham, just like I do, or upside down, and upside down M for Moses. But notice they're both coming back to the promised land. No matter where the Hebrews go, their goal is to return to the promised land in ancient times. They wanted to come to this land of Canaan. Now, the thing about the land of Canaan was that they were not the only people who wanted this land. There were other people who lived in this area that they had to interact with. So many groups, such as the Phoenicians and the Philistines, and we're going to look at those two groups in just a minute, lived in the promised land of Canaan. And you'll have a bunch more info on the Phoenicians in your level work, so make sure you're paying attention to that. So this promised land right here is right along the Mediterranean coast, and it's a narrow strip of land because there's deserts and mountains out here. So the Hebrews believed that it was God's will for them to live in Canaan. They said, this is the land that God promised Abraham. He made that covenant with us. So they fought a series of battles for victory, led by their military leader, Joshua. After the Israelites were victorious, they divided the land among the 12 tribes, and they were ruled by political and military leaders called judges, and there were even some female judges. Most Israelites farmed and raised animals. They worshiped God in a place called a tabernacle, and it was portable so they could move around as they needed to. Let's take a closer look at that land of Canaan. Remember, it's a very, very desirable area because here's Egypt, here's Mesopotamia, and all this area through here are trade routes. So whoever controls this area can make a lot of money and get a lot of wealth. So our two main people that the Hebrews had to come up against were the Philistines and the Phoenicians. And the Philistines were down here closer to the Egyptian side of things. And the Phoenicians were up here closer to modern-day Turkey. Okay, so both groups had to kind of contend with Israel and with the Hebrews, and we'll see kind of how that plays out. So as far as historians can tell, the Philistines were a group called the Sea People that migrated from near present-day Greece, where we've just been talking about, and settled all along the coast. Right about here is where they were mostly settled. They established all sorts of walled cities. There were 5 main walled cities in that red area where I have the dot. And you can still see some of the walls of those cities today. So they were great builders. And they were very skilled in making iron tools and weapons. Now, they were polytheistic, but they accepted ideas from other cultures as well, as long as you didn't try to, take over. But that was the problem. The Hebrews believed that their God, only one, remember, the Hebrews are monotheistic, had promised them this land. So we're going to see some battles get fought between the Philistines and the Hebrews. And if you're familiar with what's called the Old Testament of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines come up a lot as enemies of the Hebrew people. In fact, one of the most famous stories from the Hebrew Bible and from the Christian Old Testament is the story of a battle between a Hebrew boy David and a Philistine soldier Goliath. Now, a lot of times generals didn't want to necessarily have all their men fighting at once, so they'd have champions from each side kind of fight a battle one-on-one. And the Hebrew Bible tells the story of a Philistine soldier who they described as a giant, and nobody could beat him until a small teenage boy came along, and the Hebrew Bible says that with their God's help, he defeated the giant. So this story it resonates for the Hebrew people because they're used to kind of being the underdogs. This boy grows up to be a very famous king, David, who we're going to learn more about in our next video notes. The other group that the Hebrews had to deal with in the land of Canaan was the Phoenicians. Now they're up a little bit further north, and the Hebrews end up trading with them more because the Phoenicians were really more of a trading people. They were very limited by geography. Now you have this same map here, and I want you to notice that it says the Lebanon mountains. Circle those mountains and draw in some mountains. So the Phoenicians didn't really have much room to spread out. So they turned to the sea for trade and established colonies, just kind of like the Greeks, all throughout the Mediterranean. So here's a map. Here's the Phoenicians right here. And it shows that all this red area is area where they established colonies. Now, eventually, this area right here where the Phoenicians established colonies is going to become a problem when Rome becomes powerful, but we're not quite there yet. Let me erase this. Boop, 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 boop. And they were amazing shipbuilders because one of the resources that the Phoenicians had was cedar wood, which is great for building boats. So here's an example of a ship that they would use. They have all sorts of storage underneath. There we go, there's my pen. Storage underneath, and they used sails, and they were able to trade very, very quickly. And they could trade some of the goods that they had specially, and we'll talk about that, whether it was that cedar wood that they could cut down from the mountain trees or some of the other things. And the Phoenicians were really smart too. One of my favorite things about them is that they really wanted to control all that territory. So what they did, every time they went into a port, they would say that there were sea monsters out there and that they barely escaped with their lives. And so they kind of scared people away from trying to take over their trading routes. Now the Phoenicians didn't just spread their lumber and their and the things they wanted to sell. They had one of the few resources of purple dye. Now that doesn't sound very interesting until you realize that in the ancient world, most clothes were just kind of a natural, boring color. It was hard to dye them. So the Phoenicians, though, along the Mediterranean Sea, had a very special kind of seashell that, when crushed up, would make a beautiful purple dye that wouldn't wash out of clothes. But they had to use thousands and thousands of these seashells to make just one bolt of cloth, so it was very, very expensive. Only the wealthiest people could afford this Phoenician purple dye, so it became a symbol of royalty. Even today, a lot of times when you see a king or queen, they're wearing this rich red and purple, and that traces all the way back to the Phoenicians. Another thing that they ended up spreading and influencing both the Greeks and the Hebrews was their alphabet. They were trading all over the Mediterranean, and they wanted an easy way to jot down the languages they heard. So unlike the hieroglyphs in Egypt or the cuneiform in Mesopotamia, they developed something where each letter stood for a sound. Each symbol didn't stand for an idea, it stood for a sound. So they could, even if they couldn't speak the language, they could kind of sound it out. And they could write very, very quickly and combine these letters to make pretty much any word. So here's the Phoenician alphabet right here. And you guys might recognize this chart from our last summative. And it influenced the Greek, Roman, and Hebrew alphabets. And you'll notice a lot of these letters are similar to the ones we have today. So one more example of cultural diffusion. So if you can read this, ladies and gentlemen, thank the Phoenicians. We'll go ahead and wrap this up for today, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see you soon. Have a great weekend.